I've now spent a year diving into the history, effects, and functions of propaganda and disinformation, and I've learned a few things. Actually, to be honest, my channel anniversary was back in May, but I'm kind of terrible at YouTube, so we're doing this now. Anyway, here are 4 lessons that I've learned this year, and 3 questions that I want you to ask yourself before you share anything on social media. Lesson number 1. You are a tribal creature. You might think you're an apex predator, but once upon a time, humans were a prey species. Our ancestors were so pathetic that they got eaten by birds. Our only hope for survival was to band together, and that changed our brains, so much so that our need to belong can overpower our ability to think rationally. Lesson number 2. People who want to take your money and make you do things know that you are a tribal creature, and they have invested a lot of time, money, and energy into learning the best ways to take advantage of that. Seriously, they've got teams of people researching this and building bot farms and grinding out AI slop to trip you up. However bad you think it is, it's worse. Lesson number 3. Your best defense against the people who want to take your money and make you do things is to learn about your tribal nature and its weak points so you can sense when you are being manipulated. Lesson number 4. It's not about you. You are not the protagonist of the internet, and beware of people or chatbots that make you feel like you are. Now, based on all that, here are 3 questions that I need you to ask yourself before you share anything on social media. 1. Do I love or hate this post? It's well known that rage bait travels quickly on the internet, but the posts to which you react positively are just as dangerous. I think hell yeah is the most dangerous emotion on the internet. Anger gets you to share something. Hell yeah gets you to join the cult. 2. Am I learning something new from this post, or am I just sharing it to make myself feel smart? That aha feeling you get when you read something and come up with a hot take isn't the end of the process, it's the beginning. That's your signal to start investigating that post and make sure it's accurate. 3. Does my community need to know this information, or am I just sharing it to boost my standing? Research shows that we not only need to belong to a tribe, but we also need to attain high status within that tribe. And sharing a banger meme can help with that. If your community is relatively benign, then no harm done, but if you belong to a community that awards high status to members who share racist or derogatory content, you're probably headed for trouble. An unexamined internet is not worth reading. I wish we could all just sit back and doom scroll, but unfortunately the times demand that we dial in and become active, inquisitive consumers of information, especially as we head into an election season. These lessons and questions are available as a PDF in the first pinned comment, and let me know if you want it as a transparent PNG so you can make a tattoo out of it or something. If you're new to the channel, check out the playlist Reptiles of the Mind Starter Pack, and if you're a regular viewer, new long-form content is on the way. Thanks for watching.